And anyone who knows anything about China, knows anything about Chinese history and the century of humiliation, who's ever talked to a Chinese leader, knows that's just not how China rolls. And especially now, under President Xi, in the new era, this is not how we roll. No, the Chinese didn't call. And we're like, right, wow. They gave you their answer. Their answer was 15% tariffs and all this. And so I think they are misreading China's intentions. China absolutely is committed 1,000% to recovering Taiwan. There's no question, it's non-negotiable. In their view, it is going to happen. And so we'll be the first person to point out, China has been a horrible actor in the South China Sea. I think this was a mistake of the Obama administration. They didn't stand fast on Scarborough Shoal.
大家好，今天要分享的是今年4月，美洲贸易全国委员会会长肖恩·斯坦在华盛顿的一次活动中演讲与谈话的节选。关于肖恩·斯坦，我们在几天前的一个视频中已经给大家做过简要的介绍。他是美国资深的职业外交官，非常熟悉中国事务，尤其是在经济领域。肖恩·斯坦从2010年开始，先后在沈阳、上海、成都的领事馆担任领导职务，为推动中美经济领域的合作做出过贡献。2024年9月10日，他被任命为美中贸易全国委员会会长。肖恩·斯坦有在中国长期生活工作的经历，是一个中国通。特别因为工作的关系，他与中国高层政府官员、智库人员等有广泛接触，对中国的政治、经济、社会等方面有较为深入的认知。例如，他知道中国对于关税战的态度，以及为应对关税战所做的准备。了解中国在台湾问题上的坚定立场，中国不会在涉及国家主权和领土完整的问题上做出让步。他也很清楚，美国对中国的战略误判并非偶然，美国对中国的认知偏差有着清晰的成因与脉络，是系统性问题，而非短期政策失误。它的背后有可追溯的逻辑链条。当然，他也了解中国随着自身综合实力的增强，在对美态度上的微妙变化，例如在维护核心利益上的立场更趋坚定，面对美国的打压会采取更主动的反制与应对，而非被动妥协。他的立场是从美国的角度出发，分析和解读美中关系，实现美国的利益最大化。他呼吁美中两国都要根据不同时期的情况调整自己的政策，具备解读和理解对方行动的能力，把战略误判的风险降到最低。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
So the reason I'm starting with the Obama administration is because of the importance of history right now in the relationship. So for those of you who were alive back then, the defining bit of the U.S.-China during that administration, I remember I was working on the China desk, and all of a sudden, we started getting all these random inquiries about something I had never heard of because I was not as erudite as all of you, having us write papers on the Thucydides trap. And is it true? And how can we refute it? And how should we think about it? What does it mean for policy? And all of these requests would come from NSC staff. And finally, we were like, well, why do we care about all of this? And all I would say is we have questions coming from on high. And they were coming from the very top. So apparently the article that kicked all this stuff off about the Thucydides trap came from the top. And there was the idea about, is it true? Obviously not. So how do we refute it and prove that it's not true? So this really animated the Obama administration. They said, how do we prove that this is not true? But more importantly, how do we prove to the world that it's not true? So in the first 100 days of Xi Jinping rising into his current position, Obama invites him to California, to the Sunnylands State. And they talked about how are we going to refute this? And what are we going to do? And so after 2.5 days of talks, they came out with sort of this vision and this approach. And this is when they said things that I thought we could never say again about the U.S.-China relationship, that a strong China is good for the world and a weak China is bad for the world. Or Obama saying that a rich China is good for the world and a poor China is bad for the world. So this kind of idea, but the animating philosophy then in the administration was that we need to work together with China on so many things that China realizes that it does better when it works with the United States and we can all partner and do stuff. So we spent the next 3 years trying to find ways to do more partnerships and do more stuff with the Chinese. And at the same time, the philosophy was, while we're doing all this stuff together, let's put a ring fence around the stuff we don't agree on and let's not be too critical. Let's not be too much pressure on that. Let's let all these other relationships grow. And then they'll realize this is where we should go. So, but then what happens is after 3 years of this, we do our 3-year policy analysis. And we're like, what did we get from this great policy? And so we had all of these metrics. How is China doing in getting along with its neighbors? How are we doing at working together on global issues? How about market access? How about human rights? How about religious freedom? How about anything that people cared about? We had this long list of things we were sort of evaluating. How are we doing on all of this? And when we did the analysis, we were doing terribly. Almost in no measure was the relationship with China or China doing any of the types of things that we had thought would happen after this policy, which was all carrots, no sticks, and didn't work. But that was an election year. And in the election year, you don't say, hey guys, we botched our China policy, vote for Hillary, who is one of the architects of this policy, right? So by the end of the administration, we realized this approach of all carrots, no sticks, didn't work. Trump administration comes in. I'll fast forward to the second half of the Trump administration to November 2017. And in November 2017, Trump goes to China and he's frustrated with how things have gone. He's frustrated that the relationship hasn't improved. And he's like, why? It's like, well, because China doesn't want anything. And there's a lot of reasons why China didn't want anything. But the strategy then became, you know what? We're going to have to make China care. We need leverage on China. We're going to use some sticks to get China and make China do what we want it to do. So we have 18 months of a policy towards China, which was all sticks and no carrots. And what happened, so by the end of the administration, we had the phase 1 trade deal. And we have the phase 1 trade deal, and most of us who had been sort of involved in all this kind of felt like, yeah, that's kind of nice, but really wasn't all that, right? So you now are the Biden administration. You come in and you're like, we are going to have a do-over with China. And you've got a lot of people that were in Trump 1.0. And the Chinese look at all the people who were in Obama 1.0 and are like, hey, good times are back. We're going to cooperate on all this stuff. But the people who were there in the Biden administration, who had been in the Obama administration, were like, well, we tried carrots. That didn't work. We tried sticks. That didn't work. What's left?
Balance.
Balance? Okay, balance. All right. Our young China watchers, what's left if carrots don't work and sticks don't work?
Divorce?
Divorce? No, not yet. That comes later. So okay, one more.
Like ensuring or kind of avoiding making an alliance around.
I'll be nicer. That's a very good answer, but no, I'm not. What happens? So the Biden administration didn't know. So for the first 6 months of the Biden administration, they don't really talk very much about China, but they realized that, okay, carrots don't work and sticks don't work. There's one thing left, and that's competition, right? In other words, we have to recognize we're not going to shape China's behavior the way we think we can by being nice and giving carrots, and we can't shape it by pressure and by sticks. So all we can do is compete. How are we going to compete? We are going to invest in ourselves so we can compete better. We're going to do our infrastructure. We're going to do training. We're going to do all this kind of things. We are going to work with friends and allies around the world. And this is going to supercharge our ability to compete. And we're going to compete with China. Well, a lot of things sort of happened during the Biden administration. And towards the end, and the Chinese could legitimately ask, well, if this is a competition, what kind of competition? Are we running a fair race? Or are we running a race where we try and trip up each other, right? And so it got kind of messy towards the end, where there was a lot more tripping than pure competition. But that was the eminent guiding philosophy of the Biden administration. We are in a strategic competition, and we need to run faster, do more, et cetera. So the Biden administration comes, the Trump 2.0 comes in, and they're sort of looking at sort of these lessons of history. And they're like, but they took a different lesson than the Obama administration. So their lesson was more about what we were talking about here. And so now I think when they came in, I remember talking to people who are now quite senior in the Trump 2.0 administration, and I would ask them, well, what's the idea? And I remember very, very clearly a conversation with a senior confirmed official. He said, we made 3 mistakes during Trump 1.0. I'm like, 3? And those 3 would be, we did not raise tariffs high enough, we did not raise them fast enough, and we did not raise them on enough goods. And so what does that mean for the philosophy then of these people coming in the Trump administration. Their idea was not that we're, need to be in this competitive mode per se, but that what we need is we need bigger sticks. We need to use harder sticks. We need to use them more effectively and more creatively. And so that's kind of where we are right now. And so for them, we have a situation where they felt like the sticks that got the results that they wanted, which was phase one from the Chinese, were essentially tariffs with a healthy dose of export controls and the occasional sanction. And so right now, the idea is let's go with what worked. So how we start from there and get to where we are, though, I think is kind of a more interesting story. And that is, so we've known from even before the administration came in that the U.S. wanted to rebalance its relationship with China. It's concerned about a lot of things. It's concerned about all of the things that the Biden administration was concerned about, but also other things. There are people who feel like China believes we're in a Cold War, so therefore we should be in a Cold War. They believe a variety of things like this. And so what I feel is that we didn't have enough young China watchers in the administration to maybe get some of the outcomes that were hoped for. And so what I would sort of posit is that from the beginning, there have been a number of pretty serious misunderstandings or missed opportunities to read China and China's behavior that has then got us into this sort of stalemate. And since I had given myself 7 minutes, I'm going to do this really fast. So what happens? So the president comes in and he wants to resolve several problems. Let's say the fentanyl problem. So they use IEEPA and they put tariffs on China. Now, before the first fentanyl tariffs go into effect, the Chinese had already given a proposal to the US government that I thought looked very credible, but maybe it wasn't, on what they were going to do about fentanyl. So they give this to the US government, but they know that the president is going to do things on tariffs that they aren't going to like, and they can understand this. So when the first round of 10% tariffs go into effect, what was China's response? China put tariffs on some manufactured goods, heavy trucks, and then did some other things. They took actions with export controls. They took actions with sanctions and some investigations. But that was sort of their answer, was we're going to do this. And then they said something else, and they were telling anyone who would listen that our response is going to be very straightforward. They had seen what had happened with Mexico and with Canada. And so they were immediately saying, looking at perhaps the behavior of those two countries, they'd say, look, we will never beg. We're not going to beg. In other words, we're not going to fly to Washington and say, please, oh, please, here's what we're going to do, make the bad tariffs go away. We're not going to do that. And anyone who knows anything about China, knows anything about Chinese history and the century of humiliation, who's ever talked to a Chinese leader, knows that's just not how China rolls. And especially now, under President Xi, in the new era, this is not how we roll. Number two, they say we're not going to be bullied. And anyone who knows anything about China, you do not have to be a young China watcher to know China is not going to allow itself to be perceived as being bullied on the world stage. And so their answer is raising tariffs after this. But then you might remember the day the tariffs went into effect, they only went into effect on China. The White House press spokesperson did her press conference. At her press conference, she said, tariffs went into effect on China, but we'll talk to China. The two presidents are going to talk, in the next 24 to 36 hours. And a couple hours later on Fox Business, a proxy for the White House, or a proxy for the president, basically came out and said, hey, look, yeah, I don't want to get ahead of the boss, but they're going to talk in the next 24 to 36 hours. So we do what all of the young China watchers do, and that was we wait 24 to 36 hours, and we go to People's Daily and Renmin Rubao, and we start looking on Truth Social, and we look at every place to get the readout. And there's no readout. So we do what everyone else does. We ring up our friends in China, the foreign ministry, and we ring up people at the White House and elsewhere. We're like, what happened in the call? And what did we hear from the White House? What did we hear from the US side? Anybody? What did they say? No, the Chinese didn't call. And we're like, right. Wow. They gave you their answer. Their answer was 15% tariffs and all this. And so there was a really missed opportunity there because the Chinese, everyone knew what the China was going to do. They weren't going to call, but there was that expectation. So that's what started us down this path. So now China's playing its role here. And so then what happens? Time starts to pass and China's got its proposal outstanding that's with the White House on fentanyl. And again, maybe it's a great proposal, maybe it's terrible. I don't know. And so they're like, we need to talk about this with somebody. So they go and they try and talk to people at the NSC. They talk to various other principals around the White House. And what do they hear? Not my issue. Or they won't take the meeting, or they won't raise. And so the Chinese are getting a little frustrated because we've got 10% tariffs because of what? Fentanyl. And now no one wants to talk with them about this. So a couple of weeks pass and we get 10% more tariffs on China for fentanyl. And what happens there? Well, now the Chinese are a little bit frustrated because of the things we all know about. So this time China responds again in a non-escalatory way, but it hits harder than the first time. Now it's 15% tariffs on agriculture and on things that are definitely in red states. And then they do more things with their export controls and their sanctions and all that. But then they do something else, which they send a signal to the US government. And they hope the US government's listening, but they're not sure the US government is listening. So they make the signal as clear as it can be. And this is when they sent what we were calling the mean tweet. But it was really a mean statement. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? So China, the embassy first, that was later repeated in Beijing, puts out a statement. And the statement basically says, okay, we know it's not about fentanyl. And how do they know it's not about fentanyl, or why do they think it's not about fentanyl? Because if it was about fentanyl, then someone would have talked to them about fentanyl. So we know it's not about fentanyl, but we don't know what it's about. So if you want a tariff war, all right, let's have a tariff war. Or if you want to have a trade war, let's have a trade war, or any other kind of war. Just tell us what you want. And this was China's way of signaling, hey guys, we're serious. We either need to negotiate or we need to do something, but we're not just going to be bullied and not have a response. So a lot of things happened. I was in Beijing. We did a lot of things to sort of try and broker discussions, and a lot of things happened. But then the reciprocal tariffs happen. And the US puts reciprocal tariffs on the world and suspends them, except for on China. And why do they not suspend them on China? Because what did China do? China retaliated.
Yeah.
And the White House seems, or the China watchers in the administration seem like they were surprised by this. And we're telling them, China is going to go. They've said, we will not be back. We will not be bullied. We're going to go each and every time. We are going to respond because our national dignity is the right thing to do and all these other things. And yet, I feel like everyone we talked to in the US government was sort of like, well, they were escalating, they were doing this, but no, they were trying to not do that. And so again, another opportunity where not accurately reading China and its intentions and how it operates and thinks about the world created sort of led us to the situation where we are. And so let me just sort of stop there and say that what you young China watchers do and what George Washington is doing to train up a generation of China scholars and what USCET is doing to promote these kinds of exchanges promotes a kind of understanding that can help us avoid getting into these situations that we're in. And now more than ever, where there is a highly competitive relationship with China, where there are not good lines of communications between the two governments, that is needed more than anything else. But really, we need the ability to interpret and to understand what China is doing, and they need the ability to interpret and understand us. And trust me, they make as many mistakes as we do, but we need to understand each other better.
肖恩斯坦在演讲中提到了修昔底德陷阱。修昔底德陷阱这个概念最早是由美国军事作家赫尔曼·沃克在1980年提出，用于描述美苏冷战，但当时并没有引起广泛关注。2012年，美国学者格雷厄姆·艾利森将其用于分析中美关系，使其成为学界和政界的热门话题。艾利森根据过去500年的历史案例指出，在16个崛起国挑战守成国的例子中，有12个走向了战争，但也有4个成功回避了战争。艾利森的核心结论是，陷阱并非宿命，而是可以避免的悲剧。关键在于双方是否能建立新的互动规则。肖恩斯坦提到这一概念，本质是触及了中美战略互动的核心框架。我们首先需要厘清，修昔底德陷阱的核心是守成国对崛起国的恐惧，而非崛起国必然挑战守成国。但美国对这一概念的运用早已偏离了理论本身，成为其对华战略焦虑的合理化工具。首先，刻意弱化守成国的责任。艾利森强调，陷阱的触发往往源于守成国对权力转移的焦虑，进而采取遏制、围堵等激化矛盾的行为。 美国将自身定位为规则维护者，将中国的正常发展扭曲为挑战规则，把陷阱的诱因归咎于中国，而非自身的霸权维护欲。第二，选择性忽略和平案例。美国政客很少提及爱迪生总结的4个成功案例，包括美国自己在取代英国成为世界霸主的过程中，双方通过权力和平交接避免战争，反而反复渲染12组战争案例，本质是为其对华强硬政策寻找历史依据，将打压中国包装成避免战争的必要手段。正是陷阱论的滥用，进一步固化了美国的认知偏差，加剧了美国的政策混乱。接下来我们继续看肖恩斯坦与主持人的互动，以及他如何回答现场观众的提问。
I think the first question I want to ask you is, I know you gave us a really thorough readout from the U.S. policy side, but you mentioned you were just in Beijing. So can you give us a bit of the texture of what you were hearing on the ground there from government officials, from academic kind of econ trade people, U.S. businesses, Chinese businesses? Was there kind of a unanimous take, or were there some discrepancies between those views?
Yeah, I think the most interesting question is, what is the Chinese government thinking? And what is it doing, and what's its approach? One thing that was really clear is that China hates this idea of having a tariff war, right? There's a perception, I think, on the United States side that somehow China's economy is so weak that the tariffs will bring China to its knees or will have a greater effect on China than it does. But in point of fact, and as the Chinese are very quick to point out, we've been predicting this day and preparing for this day since at least mid-2018. And so we've taken steps to harden our economy and harden our system against this kind of coercive measure from the United States. So what they're saying is that, well, they don't like it. Well, it interrupts a lot of them sort of moving forward towards their economic goals. They're also saying that, but you know what? We're a whole lot better prepared to go through this than the United States. So US, bring it on. And the more the Chinese saw statements from the US side sort of denigrating what they interpreted as denigrating the Chinese side, the more I would see sort of the determination level getting ratcheted up. And I don't need to sort of repeat the statements here, but I remember with one of them in particular, I had a meeting with a Chinese minister that I then ended up seeing a second time. And we'd been encouraging contact at the leader level. And he, in the meeting, he sort of pulls up his phone. He's like, and I see him go into his WeChat. And he goes into his WeChat and he starts showing me WeChat videos that are sort of translated into Chinese and all that, of various US officials all put together about what they're saying about China. And he's like, look at this. How could we possibly engage in dialogue as long as this is the type of rhetoric? So we there's just no way. So we have to try some other way. So the first thing is the Chinese government is saying, hey, we can outlast the United States. We're not going to blink first. And the second is, for a while at least, I think I commend the White House for trying to dial down the rhetoric and trying to be more pragmatic in its approach. But that was kind of a setback that I think they now need to get back. So I think that's the biggest. But the second thing is the United States is not alone in its difficulty in interpreting some of the things from the other side. One of the things that the Chinese, I think, often misinterpret is they project, or they think that there's a grand strategy, often where there's not. And so what happens is they will take strange points and link them together and say, oh, this is the US policy, and this is where it's all going, when in point of fact, they really are sort of discrete actions that are not designed to be linked. And so, but what happens is once they get into this idea that this is all a grand strategy, according to maybe the US 5-year plan, or the guidance of the leading small group on political theory or whatever, that they make it seem like the United States is going to be less flexible and less sort of adept at responding than it is. And so it causes the Chinese to be more sort of stiff and formalistic in how they approach it. So the two sides have sort of mirror images of those difficulties.
Great. Well, thank you. And so I think you gave a good insight of how the Trump administration is seeing this. They didn't do enough in the first administration to get to their ends. What do you define as their ends? What are they trying to get out of this relationship? And how would you respond to some of the national security hawks or the trade hawks who think that this is fine if the U.S. and China separate their trade, separate their economies? It's in the U.S. national interest and probably a good, some short-term pain for long-term benefit. How do you How do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a view within the administration. I remember a conversation I had with another senior U.S. official who, when I was talking about the possibility of Chinese retaliation, the person he said, well, we know the Chinese can't really retaliate to our tariffs. And my question is, how do we know that? And the answer was, well, during the first Trump administration, we did tariffs. And China gave us their best shot. They went after agriculture. They hit us back with tariffs. They put pressure on us. And what happened? We had no inflation. Our economy continued to grow. Things kept going. So we know that China can't hit back. And I said, well, but, I think things might now be different than they were in 2018 for a lot of reasons. And he said, well, if they hit back and they hit back effectively, well, that's not a bad thing. I was like, okay. And the answer was, all that does then is we hit them back and it just hastens the decoupling of our two economies. And so that particular official now, I haven't met with him recently, but some of my members have. And this official will describe his outlook on China as essentially what he says is Cold War 2.0. That we are in a Cold War and we have been since the last Cold War ended. We were just slow to recognize that. And so if that is what you believe, and that is your outlook on China, whether it's right or wrong, there are certain policy imperatives that you have to have. And that is, how do we protect ourselves from the China threat? And then everything looks like a national security issue. And everything looks like, okay, it's really important then that we isolate and protect ourselves from China. So that is one accepted worldview right now in the current administration that's held by a number of officials. I think that's sort of one extreme end of the continuum. But the continuum is not the longest continuum in the world of policy differences. At the other end of the continuum, what I see is I'll see people who are a little more sober-minded, and they'll say, well, we do need decoupling or we need strategic decoupling. And there's a variety of things that strategic decoupling might mean, but that's the scope of what it is. But so for anyone in there, the goals that they're looking for are, how do we make our own economy more resilient? How do we eliminate national security threats, real or perceived, from China? And that's sort of the important thing. But that's all of the administration except for one person, right? And who is that other one person?
Donald Trump.
DJT. Donald Trump doesn't see the world in the sort of Cold War or decoupling sort of way. He sees China. I think he's actually the most visionary person in the administration on the potential for the U.S.-China relationship. And he said before the election, he said, hey, I want tariffs. Why? I don't want China to build it over there. I want them to build it over here. And the thing that was the most interesting to me is go back and watch. I think it was Wisconsin where he was trying this line, and he's got the whole world. He's like, I don't want China to build cheap goods over there. Boo! I want them to come and build it here. Yay! Right? And so I think if there's anybody that can move the public needle on China, it's Donald Trump, right? And it's the same thing with TikTok, right? You have the US Congress saying TikTok is such a national security threat. We need to ban it. We need to ban it today, or it needs to completely change. And, in that group was the the House Select Committee on China that put this forward, and it passes Congress. And what happens? Trump comes out and he says, you know what? Yeah, the letter of the law may say it all has to be resolved before I'm in, but let's renegotiate. Maybe we can come up with a deal. And what's the response from Congress? What's the response of all the national security hawks except for one? Well, why don't we give the president a chance? Even the head of the Select Committee comes out and says, you know what? Let's give the president a chance to do a deal. So what that means to me is Donald Trump does not see the world in terms of national security competition with China. He doesn't see the world in terms of tech competition with China. He does see potential for the two countries to work together on certain things. But he may be the only person in this administration who does that. And so I think the way he would define success in the relationship with China is different than some of his national security hawks would see success with China, or different than maybe many people in this room, maybe different than the business community might. But I think that's sort of the scope of different views that people would have on what do we want with China? Those are where we hope to have the policy lead.
Yeah. Well, great. I mean, I think that preempts my next question, but so we're looking at the, econ and trade lens, and that's really been the bulk of Trump's kind of actions towards China so far. What do you think this will, pretend for the next, we've got a while to go. We got 3 years ahead of us. What do you think we can expect next from this administration on China, and not just on trade? There's a lot of, other issues on the table that we haven't really kind of got to yet in Trump's foreign policy agenda. Taiwan, military, geopolitical concerns, cooperation on, public health, other types of kind of shared global issues. What is your take so far?
Yeah, so let me start with trade. Trump is famous for saying trade wars are easy to win. And I think if we look at what we've seen coming out of the administration since last Thursday, we've really seen the White House become much more pragmatic on how we might approach negotiations with China, how we might enter into negotiations with China. But again, we hear that, there'll be a deal in 3 or 4 weeks. The current mutually imposed embargo, says Bassett, is unsustainable. And he's absolutely right. It is unsustainable. But what I worry about is, again, I feel like the two sides may not accurately be taking the measure of the other. And so when the administration says we need to resolve this tariff impasse, I think they're looking at this through a very specific lens. And that very specific lens is the IEEPA tariffs, right? So this is the reciprocal tariffs and maybe the fentanyl tariffs. They're not looking at anything beyond that, but they see the tariffs as the issue to be resolved. And maybe that can be resolved easily, mutually, or maybe not. But talking to Chinese officials, that's not how they see the issue. They see the IEEPA tariffs as part of a broader U.S. strategy to contain China's growth or to hold China back. So if the administration goes to China and says, hey, let's just walk the tariffs back, China's like, yeah, no, that's not. I fear that China's going to say, well, that's not really the whole thing, because in addition to the tariffs, we have more export controls, we have other types of sanctions. And besides, we don't want to come back and negotiate this again in 2 weeks or 2 months or 6 months or a year. We need something that's sort of durable. What about all of the other tariffs that are sort of loaded up and ready to go? We've got all the 232s, including a new one announced today on trucks. We've got the potential for tariffs related to purchases of Venezuelan energy. We've got recent sanctions. And so China wants to talk about and resolve all of those issues, and they see that as all part and parcel of the tariffs, but the White House doesn't. And so my fear is that the perception of the White House that China really wants to do a deal and wants to do a deal now, combined with underestimating just how broad the issues are from China's perspective, means I don't think we get there in 3 to 4 weeks. And I don't think that the economy can handle 3 or 4 more weeks at tariffs in triple digits. So I don't know where we go from here, but I do think that it's something that needs to be resolved. In terms of broader issues, I think that the Trump administration is doing some things right. And one of the things that I've been sort of impressed with and frankly surprised by is the eagerness of certain countries to actually do deals with the United States. For example, most of the ASEANs are like, yes, please, let's do a deal, bring it on, and here's what we're going to do, and making offers that would have taken, years to negotiate, right? So they're doing some things right, but they're also doing some things that are hard. And as part of those negotiations, countries are trying to keep this largely in the economic space, but the Trump administration sees an opportunity to expand it into the geopolitical space and other things. And so in some of these negotiations, like, okay, well, we want to talk about maybe bases, or we want to talk about, purchase of military hardware. We want to talk about what is your role going forward going to be towards participation in the Belt and Road, or what's your role with going forward going to be in terms of your willingness to accept Chinese investment or Chinese exports. And so I think what's going to make this harder is the more the Trump administration includes, not necessarily that they're wrong, but includes national security issues in economic negotiations, the harder it's going to be to make those deals happen. And I think they're not going to be in a position to really do a deal with China until they have other deals in place first. And so there's a lot of optimism right now in the White House that within 30 days, there's going to be, a dozen deals. And I hope that's right, but I'm not sure that it is. But again, that's all going to complicate its negotiations with China, is China's going to see those deals as being anti-China and containing China, and that again will complicate negotiations. So all that is to say, I think there's a hard path that leads to a de-escalation between the United States and China. And what that means is, because it's a hard path, there's going to be serious damage done to both economies that's totally unnecessary, because neither country is going to be able to figure out how to get us into this de-escalatory cycle. So I'm now hoping that some of the young China watchers are going to tell me why I'm wrong, because, oh, please, I want to be wrong. But this is what I fear is coming.
So thank you very much for your insights. These perspectives on tariffs are really important, but I actually want to pivot to a different economic question regarding China and the U.S. and their interchange. During the trade war, during Trump's first term, there was a lot of scrutiny on foreign investment in China, and there's a lot of pressure that was put on these businesses, and a lot of these companies were starting to divest or thinking about divesting. That was kind of a theme of the trade war, as I recall. Do you feel that the second term there's going to be renewed scrutiny on American businesses and European businesses in China? And I guess to extend that question, do you feel like they're going to be implementing a screening system for outbound investment?
Okay.
And sorry, would you mind introducing yourself as well? I should have said.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Peter Drucker. I lived in China for 10 years. I work at Jane's as a senior China analyst.
Okay. No, great question. So I would answer that two ways. First, one thing that we saw during the first trade war, I was in China throughout the whole trade war and then through COVID, the companies moving out of China was dramatically overstated. In terms of when we would survey members, it was still a fraction of a percent that was actually moving out, except for those whose business just disappeared, right? Was there investment that was diverted? Absolutely. Were there projects that may have gone somewhere else? Absolutely. But companies didn't really move out en masse. Even earlier than through the Biden administration, the same sort of thing. We had a wave after the reopenings from COVID. And that happened not because of geopolitical pressure from the United States, but there were companies that thought if we can tough it out through COVID, we're going to get what we had in the United States. We're going to get this sideways L style recovery, where things are going to go up and they're going to be better. And so we'll get a quick recovery. And then what they saw was instead they saw this sort of, up and then, cliff that fell off. And then companies realized, all right, maybe we're not going to stick around. And so we had a wave of closures and companies moving in that post-COVID period because it didn't get better the way they thought. Now, though, I think it's absolutely different. Now we will see quite potentially a wave of closures for, both in the United States and then also companies leaving China. And the reason is pretty simple. Right now, where tariffs are above 100%, there's just no trade to be done, right? It is few and far between where there's a product that anyone's going to pay that much sort of in tariffs. And so there's a lot of US companies that are going to have to leave because even though they've been very profitable in China, now because they're unable to get inputs into China in a cost-effective manner, they're going to be priced out of the marketplace, and so they'll be leaving. So we've talked to a number of our members who have basically said, yeah, we've got weeks to months to get the tariffs fixed, or there will be nothing we do that's profitable here, and we'll have to move on. So there will be, not necessarily due to geopolitical pressure, but due to just the realities of tariffs mean you're no longer competitive. That's going to bite on the U.S. side just as much. I had a conversation on Friday with a medium-sized U.S. company that many people think was a large U.S. company, but it's a medium-sized private U.S. company, does business in the Midwest and in the South. And what he was telling me is he said, look, we export globally. And China is maybe 30% of our outside of U.S. business. And so what does that translate into? About 7,000 containers a year of product that goes to China. But they also have to import 1,000 containers of raw materials from China per year. And so he said what we realized was, our business in China was going to fall to zero because we weren't going to be able to export. But what we totally underestimated was that we were going to have a lot of our world exports fall to zero as well, because now we're paying for our 1,000 containers coming in. Now tariffs are so high, we're no longer competitive in Europe or other places in East Asia or even in Latin America. And so they've lost sort of their global markets. And so the question is, will they now be able to stay open in the US in this sort of tariff thing? So that's one thing. But second, there isn't yet an outbound investment screening mechanism, but there is the outbound investment sort of reporting mechanisms, which are going into effect through Treasury. And so do we expect that will probably become a more stringent or a more of a regulatory regime, is more of a reporting regime? I think that's quite likely. Whether it happens this year or next year, that's something I think that's coming. I think that most people expect.
I'd like a little discussion of a couple of very important geopolitical issues that to expand the discussion about any deals with China. The first one, obviously, is Taiwan. And there is a constant threat of invasion, rather more likely an embargo of Taiwan. What a lot of us fear is that in making deals with Xi Jinping, Trump may be tempted to give up Taiwan. So that's one question that's related to the deal making. Another involves the South China Sea, where China has been very aggressive over the last 10 years. I remember Xi Jinping promising Obama, we're not going to militarize these islands. Don't
In the
worry.
Rose Garden, I was there, yeah, so, yes.
So there has been a terrific change. It produces a lot of tension with some of our allies, with the Philippines above all, with Malaysia, with Brunei, with Vietnam. And Vietnam is a formidable problem for China. So how would you relate the South China Sea issues to some of these international trade problems? And don't forget the problem with Taiwan.
Let me start with Taiwan, because I think Taiwan is easy to sort of dispense with that particular one. So I remember I've been in China and Taiwan, lived in Taipei, I've got many friends there and love Taiwan, and also lived in China. And so I think that the China watching community in the US has kind of botched a lot of it on Taiwan. And where I think they botched it is I think they are misreading China's intentions. China absolutely is committed 1,000% to recovering Taiwan. There's no question, it's non-negotiable. In their view, it is going to happen. Where I think we get some misreading is, I think if we go back, a year and a half to the election of William Lai. I remember reading about this in the United States and seeing it just being completely different than the view from Beijing and talking to government officials and Taiwan watchers who were in the Chinese government think tanks. Here on the US, what I saw in the press coverage was, Taiwan, China's arch enemy, the DPP, wins the election, things are going to be bad or things are going to get worse. And in Beijing, I'm talking to the think tanks and they're like doing cartwheels, like this is the best thing that could have ever happened. And why? Well, because, Tsai Ing-wen had an absolute majority. Plus she had the parliament, right? The legislative yuan was controlled by her. So we had one party rule by DPP. Now we have William Lai, who wins with a plurality of the vote, not even a majority, and they lost the legislative yuan. So China's like, yep, this is great. And then the next election is going to be better. So that was the first thing, because then they realized that William Lai's ability to really do anything too extreme and too irrevocable is constrained compared to Tsai Ing-wen. But the second, the more important argument, and I would say that in China's eyes, the current geopolitical system is probably reinforcing this view. And when I talk to Chinese officials, when I talk to party officials, I talk to old party cadres, this idea is absolutely hardwired and baked into the psyche, into the identity. And it is the East, led by China, is rising and the West is inevitable decline. And as they sit in Zhongnanhai and they watch what's happening in the United States, they say, aha, look, all of the things that we predicted will happen are happening. The NATO alliance is potentially weakened. The Pacific alliances are potentially weakened. We think, Chinese, think America is committing economic suicide. They're giving us everything that we wanted, and they're doing it for free, and they're doing it to themselves. And so the view right now, I think, in Zhongnanhai, and like probably you and like other people, we talk to a lot of Chinese officials and retired Chinese officials, is very much, no, the real strategy now is to do two things. Keep up the balance of terror with Taiwan so no one gets any ideas or has any illusions that they're going anywhere. Got to keep that sort of tapped down. But at the end of the day, we don't really need to do anything, because eventually the people in Taiwan are going to realize, hey, we were betting on the wrong horse. Do we want to have stable, prosperous, happy China, or do we want to have, sort of the West and where it's leading? And so while I may disagree with their conclusions, their belief is time is on their side, and eventually the people of Taiwan will see the error of their ways and will come home. So I think that I'm much less concerned about the risk of a conflict over Taiwan than I was prior to the election of William Lai. And certainly the way Chinese leadership and party members talk about it is different than it was before William Lai. The South China Sea, I think, is a really fascinating case that's different. And so we'll be the first person to point out, China has been a horrible actor in the South China Sea. I think this was a mistake of the Obama administration. They didn't stand fast on Scarborough Shoal. And then, they believed somehow, though, despite all evidence to the contrary, that at the end of the day, if the arbitral panel ruled in the Philippines' favor, they believed, again, against all odds, that China would somehow find a way to navigate in this space. And obviously China didn't. But now what's happened is I think there is a real concern about the value of the so-called US security umbrella for East Asia. And so what we just saw Xi Jinping go to Vietnam. He was his second state visit to Vietnam, was treated very well. And Vietnam is now trying to not choose between the US and China. And they're going to do everything they can to not choose between the US and China. But now they will be much more open to China than they might have been in the past. Ditto for, we just saw with Anwar in Malaysia, very, very open to working with China. Of course, they also have South China Sea conflicts. The odd man out, of course, is the Philippines. And, China feels the need to demonstrate, here's what happens if you stand up to us, but then to Vietnam and to Malaysia and to others, here's what happens when you are kind to us. So it's a good old classic divide et impera strategy that has been perfected by, everyone from the Romans onward to, divide and rule. And I think they're playing that very deftly. So I don't think it means anything good for US security issues. I don't think it means anything good for South China Sea security issues. But I think the reality is that countries are going to realign based on where they see their security and their economic benefit. And it's going to be different a year from now than it was a year ago.